Hi everyone, welcome to Glow with Grace. So today we have a very special interview guest. I'm very excited and I'm kind of nervous because I'm not used to being the interviewer anymore. Today we are super blessed to have Daniel Vitalis with us to talk to us a bit about civilization, indigenous people, and how might we mix those things together for a happy outcome for everyone. So thank you, Daniel, so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So if anyone isn't familiar with Daniel's work, Daniel is a speaker and a writer on all kinds of interesting topics, health, nutrition, natural water from springs, indigenous people, connecting to nature, rewilding, all kinds of things like that. And what he really loves to focus on is how to mesh the kind of wisdom of indigenous people into modern life. Like how does that work? And that's what we want to focus on today in this talk. And if you want to check out Daniel's sites, they are danielvitalis.com, surthrival.com, and findaspring.com. So, Daniel, I finished reading this book like 2.5 weeks ago, Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And the second I finished reading it, I emailed you. I was like, oh my God. And today I just read back over my email that I sent you and I was like, that's pretty funny. I was just so fired up. So anyone who isn't familiar with this book, it's pretty much all about the effect that civilization is having on the planet and kind of raising a lot of different thoughts about that. And I knew that this Daniel Vitalis, had read this a long time ago. So when I finished reading it, I was like, oh my God, Daniel, what can I do? So, this book came out in like 1990, I think, but I only just got hold of it a wee while ago. So what I wanted to ask you first of all was, I know you read this years ago. What kind of impact did this have on you when you read it, and in terms of your choices and where you're at now in your life?
Wow, that book, actually I haven't seen that book in so long, so I read it, I would say I was probably 19 or 20 years old when I read it. It had a tremendous impact that is now more apparent to me that you show me the book again, because I see how much my work has paralleled what's in there. That book is a fictional story, of course, where the author is using a fictitious character to tell the story of human beings as an animal and as its civilization, which I would like to make a distinction about in a moment, and what effect it's had on the planet. I feel like actually my work has become sort of a practical implementation guide for a lot of the stuff that's in there. I wouldn't have thought about that except that you brought it back into my life recently. So I guess it's had a tremendous impact, in addition, of course, a lot of other stuff too. But that book really helped me make a distinction. And let's make that distinction now for the people who are listening to us. There's a big difference between a culture and a civilization. We sometimes confuse these things. The word civilization comes from that word civil, civility. It refers to people living in cities. So there's a big difference between human beings living in small tribal villages compared to people living in cities. Basically, a city is a place where it becomes so populated and that population takes over so much of an area that they actually cannot produce their food and resources from within that area, and then they have to go out to the surrounding landscape further and further to bring in resources in order to basically resource the people who are living within that city. And cities, of course, are sedentary. So a really good distinction for people here is that people living naturally on the planet, human beings are a kind of animal. We classify ourselves currently as Homo sapiens sapien. We're a type of primate or a hominid. We have a natural lifestyle. Now, our natural lifestyle is bizarre compared to other animals. Our natural lifestyle, all the way back since before we were humans, when we were another form, other hominids, prior to Homo sapien, like Homo erectus, for instance, or Homo habilis, even then, those hominids were breaking stones to make tools. They were, of course, working with wood, and they had the ability to make fire and control fire. So we're a weird animal. We're a technological animal with fire and tools. But we still live naturally on the planet. Human beings living naturally looks like we live in small tribal communities. And we basically travel a circuit to get all our food and resources throughout the year. And a civilization is different. They begin domesticating, basically genetically altering plants and animals through breeding and through controlling their reproductive process, controlling their food, controlling their environment, and actually manipulate organisms into a new shape, harness that, and then they don't have to travel anymore. They grow all that stuff through the process of agriculture. Now, we all grew up around agriculture and civilization, so a lot of us just think that's normal, but actually it's really new. It's so new. In fact, check this out. Civilizations are so new that really they're not even tested. What tests have been done have been about 6,000 years worth now, have gone really badly. So if we were going to look at it from a scientific perspective, it'd be like, okay, here we live on the planet for our species in its current form for 190,000 years. Until 10,000 years ago, we start doing agriculture, and everything goes downhill really fast. So essentially, it's like a failed experiment.
Right. Yeah, I think I can imagine that people watching this right now are finding this really hard to grasp. The idea that agriculture might not be the optimal kind of way for us to be living. I know when I first heard that, when I was reading a different thing by Daniel Quinn, and he was saying, we have this image as humanity that the kind of ideal way to be living is to be, doing agriculture and eating stuff that's grown by agriculture. And I was like, yeah, what's wrong with that? So I can imagine it's kind of hard for people to understand. Could you maybe go into that a bit more? Like, what is it about agriculture that led us to where we are, the mess that we're currently in?
Yeah, and I'll try to reduce the jargon a little bit, and I'll try to give an analogy. I want people to understand what wild is first.
Right.
So let's say, if I was to go into my backyard and observe a squirrel today, what I would note was that the squirrel's running around, he's trying to gather food up, but he's not putting seeds in the ground, growing them, waiting for them to produce fruits, and then harvesting those seeds off. He's not tilling soil or clearing land or doing any agriculture. He's just gathering from what is naturally growing in his environment. Now, of course, he ends up developing synergistic relationships with the species that he eats, right? This is a key part of it. It's like that kind of Lion King cycle of life thing, that everything eats other things that are alive. That's spiritually one of the most challenging things, I think, for us to reconcile with living here on the planet is something dies so that we can live, whether it's a plant, an animal, a fungi, or a microorganism. We consume it, its life force is basically absorbed into us, and then eventually we die and things eat us, and it's this cycle that is beautiful but also poignant. It's got there's a sadness to it, too. So the squirrel's going to run about, and he's going to prey upon different organisms, but over time, they develop synergy. So that organism begins to rely on the squirrel, and the squirrel relies on that organism that it eats, let's say the acorn, and they live in a kind of synergistic back and forth. They tend each other, but neither one farms the other. That's living wildly. Now, human beings lived wildly for a long time on this planet, most of the time we've been alive. We ate lots of different things. We ate plants, we ate animals, we ate insects, we ate fungi, we ate things that were fermented. In other words, we ate microorganisms. But we ate them all wild. So we were basically foragers, or what we call hunter-gatherers. Right. Now, at some point, human beings get turned on to this idea of putting a seed in the ground intentionally and letting it grow back. Now, probably that didn't start off with big gardens. Probably started off pretty simple. In fact, what we know is that a lot of hunter-gatherers, it's not like they didn't know that this would work. Of course, they understood that seeds brought forth plants. And oftentimes, there's things. One plant comes to mind up here, the wild leaf, or what we call the ramp, that oftentimes when we harvest that rhizome, we then take the seed head and drop it into the hole where we pull the root out so that plants will sprout forward the next year. Now that's kind of tending the wild, but it's not really gardening yet. Mm-hmm. Now gardening, we get into a different mindset. We're actually going to clear away an area, and now we're going to start putting seeds in the ground. Now, clear away an area doesn't fully reveal what's actually going on. What are we clearing away? Other life forms, right? Clearing away means that we are basically going to do like a genocide on all the species that are there in that area, kill them, push them away. Then we're going to take the soil, which is really a very complex community of living organisms who are shielded by the skin of the earth from UV light. And what we're going to end the atmosphere. What we're going to do is turn that upside down and expose all those guys to the light, right? So now we're making a wound into the earth. And then we plant those seeds in there, and then we fight everything else around it, basically creating a deforestation zone. Now, in small plots, that can be pretty sustainable. But once we start doing it on a large scale, what we end up getting into, and that's what we see in North America here, and of course all over the UK now as well, these are whole continents that are deforested. Right. Because agriculture is essentially deforestation. A lot of the plants, the big focus of my work, as you know, has been to try to talk to people about where the foods that they eat actually come from. Like, where do these organisms come from? A lot of them are weedy plants that we've domesticated into the vegetables that we eat now. Mm-hmm. Important to understand that what weedy plants are. Weedy plants grow up in areas that have been disturbed. They're kind of like a Band-Aid that holds the soil, gets the soil back together until sort of the forest or the natural ecosystem of the area can come back. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that if you've ever moved into a new home, say one that's on a fresh lot, what you see is sort of clear the area to build the house, and all these weeds start growing up, and eventually, if you didn't take care of it, the forest would close that hole back in, right? The weeds are the in-between. They're the Band-Aid on the broken up soil. So weeds tend to follow humans because humans tend to break up soil everywhere. So we have these weeds that have followed us all over the place. So if you're foraging food in New England, where I live, you end up eating a lot of plants that actually originate in the UK and follow people over here into the disturbed soils, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's my point. What agriculture is a wound made on the ecosystem. It's essentially a kind of intentional deforestation. And then what you do is you keep that environment constantly in the wound phase, the Band-Aid phase, so that all can come up in those weeds that you select, and then anything else that tries to come in and fill that area back in, you push back out. So it's a kind of, it keeps the ecosystem in a dying phase, or trying to regenerate phase. And human beings have done that across the whole world. We've used most of the arable land at this point. So what we're doing is we're creating an intentional deforestation. It's hard for me not to go further here.
Please.
Well, a lot of the food that we almost all of the food. I mean, it's so much of the food, we could basically say all of it. There's a tiny fractional percent of foods available to us today that are not domesticated. Almost everything we're eating is domesticated, be it plant or animal. And what I mean is they're not naturally occurring organisms. They're forms that have been brought into existence through human breeding programs. Right. So that would be all of the fruits that we're eating, all the vegetables we're eating. So, our lettuces today come from the wild form, the prickly lettuce, which is a very different plant. Our apples today come from a wild form, which is a very different type of fruit. Our broccolis come from the wild brassica, which would look to your eye like a weedy plant. Now, we think of all these foods as really natural foods, but they're not to the Monsanto level. Right, that's way further down the line, but they're certainly not natural anymore, and it's important for the listener to know this right now. Every time we look at a wild food, we find that it has more nutrients than its domesticated counterpart. This is always true. It's true on the vitamin level, the mineral level, the phenol level. So if we took blueberries that were wild, the little ones, and blueberries, the big, juicy, domesticated ones, we find that the little guy was packed with more nutrition and had less calories. And we find that the big, juicy one had more calories but less nutrition. And this has led to a situation where human beings are creating constant deforestation. They're eating too many calories and not getting enough nutrition. So what do you end up with? You end up with a world full of sick, fat people who are starving to death while they're overeating in an environment that's completely decimated and deforested, running around trying to figure out how they're going to save the earth. It's like, it's crazy. And it all goes back. Something we chatted about, I brought up to you when we were first emailing about this, is if we can get outside of all the religious fundamentalist paradigms for a second and look at some of these ancient scriptural texts just as historical documents. It's fascinating what the Bible says in the Genesis account, because it essentially describes a man and a woman living in total harmony in a garden, essentially. And all they have to do to live in that garden is simply name everything. It's really beautiful. There's no death. There's this perfect utopian situation in the garden. Then this critical thing happens, right? The original sin happens, and immediately what it says is as their punishment, they now have to till the fields, which will bring forth thistles. And they'll do it by the sweat of their brow to get their bread. Now, prior to this, they didn't eat bread, because bread is made from the seeds from domesticated grains. Prior to that, they were eating whatever was wild. Now in the story, they suddenly have to work. It's going to be laborious. They're going to sweat. It's going to hurt. And they're literally kicked out of the garden. The story is really about agriculture. And at least from my perspective, it's about this transition where we went from a very nice utopian lifestyle, living in nature, to a place of trying to dominate, fight against, and contend with nature, constantly ripping her apart to get her to bring forth basically our bread. And we do it at our labor. So for those who are going, yeah, wait a second, it probably would have been really hard work, though, to live in the wild. Actually, it's way less work. And that's the shocking conclusion that all the anthropologists have come to. In fact, it's such a shocking conclusion that anthropologists have been left asking the question, as are archaeologists, asking the question, why would we have ever started growing grain in Mesopotamia? Because we went from working your average 12 to 15 hours a week to meet our needs to 40 plus. We went from having near perfect health to the diseases of civilization. We went from having large, robust skeletons and bigger brains to smaller brains and arthritis in our skeleton. This happens immediately in the fossil record when we start farming. So it actually was a painful transition that led to more work. Interesting hypothesis is, and that's emerging right now, is that once they started working with the wild wheat, they realized they could make beer from it. And in order to consistently be able to produce beer and bread, but likely more likely beer than bread, they began to grow those that week. Now here's the thing: once you start growing, see, people who live naturally in the wild, these hunter-gatherer civilizations. If we were to just look at some case studies on the few remaining tribes, what we would see is that everybody in the tribe works pretty equally to meet their needs. Mm-hmm. Nobody gets a free ride. There's no Congress who gets once elected gets their salary for life or anything like that. There's no president. There's no priest who gets to doesn't have to work. They don't have that. It's subsistence living. So everybody has to contribute to get back their needs. Now, what happened in Mesopotamia and likely in China and South America pretty simultaneously is that once people figured out how to farm grains, they had a surplus of food. They could produce more food than they needed to eat. That created the first form of basically currency or wealth. So somebody got to be in control or overseeing all that excess grain. Because there was excess grain, there were certain individuals who didn't have to work now for their food. Those are the people who would oversee the grain. That would be like an elite kind of part of society. Priesthoods, kings and queens. Once people stopped moving and stayed in one place and started to overpopulate past the normal size for human settlements, they needed to start regulating and policing. So what ends up happening is very quickly you create an elite system where you end up with a royalty or a king or queen or some kind of ruling elite. You end up with some kind of spiritual, some kind of priesthood who oversees all of the calendar dates and oversees all of the sort of the plantings and the harvestings and all of this stuff. And before you know it, you end up 10,000 years later in the situation we're in, where you are so hyper-regulated and so over-legislated that you can't move through your house without being sure if you're breaking the law or not, right? That's where it goes. So it goes from a place of not really having any laws, but having a paradigm of ethics, to this place of being totally over-regulated. It goes from a place where everybody works together to a place where a whole lot of us work for very few of us. Right. I mean, that all comes out of agriculture. So essentially, once we started doing agriculture, here's what happened. We all started working more. We all started to develop diseases. We started to become slaves to people who ruled over us. We started to be policed. We started to have wars. All of this stuff, land ownership, deforestation, and we can go on all day. The ills of the world is shockingly simple. They come from departing from our natural way. That's that simple. We left behind the natural world. We started on this crazy experiment where basically we wanted to hijack nature and take control of it, rather than allowing this mysterious feminine earth force to be in control. It's too scary. We want to regulate that. And by regulating, we've created a prison for ourselves, and we've actually initiated the 6th extinction level event on the planet, just so we could have, I guess, beer. Shocking.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. That covered so much already of what I wanted to go into. That was amazing. So, yeah, I remember in here, there's a point at which the conversation is about, you know, people are too scared. Like, people who live in our kind of reality, our kind of modern civilization culture, like you said, it's like the idea of going and living as a hunter-gatherer, it just seems like there wouldn't be enough food, you know? It's too scary. Like, that's people's main underlying fear, which, you know, is expressed in here. And even for me, like, reading this and knowing the things that I know, I look at, like, the kind of uncontacted tribes, for example, here in South America, and I just think, wow, like, it's so amazing and it's so appealing. And yet I cannot imagine for myself actually going and living like those people. Like, seriously, to imagine, okay, tomorrow I'm going to drop everything here and go and live in the wild with those people. It's just a step way too far, you know? And I think that's how it is for most people in our culture. So, you know, what can we do? Like, that's kind of the point that I came to after reading this. Like, I have to admit, I'm not about to go and run out and live in the wild, as much as it's appealing to me. So what can I do?
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that is, could you even do it? I personally don't think you can. Let me explain. Let's back up here a little bit. Earlier I said we're called Homo sapiens sapiens. My feeling, my view on all of this is that we have made a taxonomic mistake or error in classifying ourselves. So I believe that it's time that we make a distinction between those people who are in those uncontacted tribes you described. So say in parts of, I'm not sure if Ecuador has that, I know Peru has some of that, Brazil has some of that. So there are tribes there who don't know we're out here.
It's amazing.
And then there's lots of remaining pockets of indigenous people who have been contacted and are really struggling to hold on to their life way. Those people, I believe, are natural human beings. They're Homo sapiens sapiens. I believe that our current form, you and I, we're a different thing. We're the domesticated form. Yeah. So in the same way that we don't call the wild lettuce Lactuca cereola, where all our lettuces come from, we don't call the lettuces we grow the same thing. We call them Lactuca sativa, and that's our way of distinguishing that, yes, it is that plant. It is technically still that wild plant, but this is the domesticated form. And we have a really great distinction for our dogs. They are gray wolves. All of our dogs are Canis lupus, just like the gray wolf, but we add the term familiaris on the end when we talk about our dogs, Canis lupus familiaris, and that's to denote that, yes, this Chihuahua is a gray wolf. It's technically a gray wolf, but it's a domesticated form of a gray wolf. Right. And it's obvious to us that it would be hard to take that Chihuahua and bring it to a pack of wild. Well, imagine the Chihuahua reading Ishmael and going, "Oh my God, I'm a wolf, and I've been living like in this Manhattan apartment and owners, and I want to go back hunting, gathering wolves. I'm going to go live with the tribe."
Totally.
It's absurd.
Right,
it's absurd
right.
Because its body's different now.
Right.
Its tolerances for the environment are different. Everything about it is different.
Right.
I mean, it scarcely resembles, on the physiognomic level, its wild ancestor. So it would have a difficult time. Its paradigm has been based on living in domesticated civilization. Domesticated means of the house, incidentally. We're all of the house. So our milieu, our environment that feels natural to us, the habitat we live in, is indoors.
Right.
You know, if you look at you and I right now, we're having this conversation. Neither of us are outside right now. We like to go outside, but where do we always come back to? The house. We're domesticated. Right. Whereas the indigenous person really basically lives outside, and the kinds of structures they build are these semi-permanent, but very exposed to the element kind of structure. So
Right.
they're not out of the house. If you were, or I were to try to go live with one of these tribes, we would struggle first with the temperatures, with the humidity levels, with the biting insects. We would risk dying from exposure to predators. We would certainly not have the sort of robust characteristics that they have from living outside. Additionally, it would be like getting a virus in your computer, right? We would be a toxic element emotionally and psychologically to the coherence of their tribe. Even if we tried our hardest, even if we were good little bodhisattvas, we bring all of this madness, right?
Yeah.
Our weird obsessions with food, our weird obsessions with sex, our weird obsessions with power, our weird obsessions with combat, all this weird stuff that we have been, movie references, right? There you are with the tribe singing, show tunes of shows you grew up on, right? And nobody knows what you're talking about, right? They're very different worlds. We can't go back to it. And realistically, most people aren't going to be around that much longer in that form. That's sad to say, but I think we've got to get pretty realistic here. It's basically this is the last generation of truly indigenous humans. This has happened before with other species. This is most notably for me, this has happened with cows. Mm-hmm. So the predecessor of the cow, which is called the auroch, Bos primigenus, that animal is extinct. So the wild cow is now extinct. There's no more of them left. There are none left. But the domestic cow still exists. So all that's left of the cow, if you'll allow me to say it, of nature's cow or God's cow, however you want to look at that, the creator's cow, that first cow is gone, and all that's left is the chihuahua form of the cow. Right? We're about to go to this situation here on Earth where the predecessor of the human being will be gone, and all that will be left are the domesticated form. Wow. That's pretty scary. I think we have an opportunity right now to do something about that. Right. What that is, I don't know. But what I do know, to come back to your original question, we're not going to be able to go back to that life very easily. There's only little pockets left where it can even be done. Right. We have, through agriculture and civilization building, changed the environment so dramatically that it can't yield enough wild food for all of us. Right. We're carrying capacity. There's a fantastic book called Tending the Wild, and it's about the state of California when the colonists first arrived and the indigenous hunter-gatherers were still living in that region. And it's called Tending the Wild because those people, when the colonists arrived, they thought they had discovered this utopia. The amount of food that was available was shocking to them in the form of plants and animals. They couldn't believe the yields of fruits, berries, nuts, vegetables. They couldn't believe the yields of salmon, of quail, of deer, of acorn. Couldn't believe it. What they didn't realize is that these indigenous people had a method of harvesting food in a way that caused more food to be produced year after year. And they were building like a bank account with surpluses of food in the environment and creating diversity over the course of time. Now, when the colonists came in, they basically harvested it all down to nothing left. And we're at this point now where most of California is being converted over, or most of the population of California is converted over to urban living. Right. If we were to go there now to try to live wildly, the challenge is that salmon run is gone, that those quail are gone, that those wild plants are not there anymore. New invasive species have been introduced. We can't go back. So really, what I think it's about looking at now is going, what's the direction forward? Right. And I wish I had really it's like one of these things. Like we all sometimes, those of us who think like this, we start taking on trying to shoulder the responsibility of figuring it out. Like I'm gonna, I would love to figure it out. I would love to be the guy who has the answer to what we're gonna do. I don't, but I have some suggestions for what we can do as individuals. Nice. And I think that's the most empowering step forward. Is as individuals we make changes in our lives, and I think that they're more than just what we eat, and they're more than just how we dress, and they're more than just how we talk. It needs to be a very comprehensive and holistic lifeway, because what we need to be doing now is creating some kind of lifestyle that, if allowed to develop over the course of generations, will reintegrate us with our planet. Our lifestyle right now is disintegrating us from our planet.
Yeah, I watched an interview with the author of this a couple of weeks ago, Daniel Quinn, and he was saying his impression at this point is if we carry on the trajectory we're on, our grandchildren, if we get to the point of having any grandchildren, they're not probably going to survive like the way that things are right now. And as a new parent, hearing that, I was just like, oh my goodness. But he also said in that interview, something that really helped me was, he said, I don't, like you were just saying, I don't think there is like one answer that I can give anyone of like, this is what you're to do. It's like everybody has their own path, and it's about spreading the message, spreading the awareness of what we're doing, and helping people to find where their place is to turn things around. Because, you know, something that he mentioned in this book that really spoke to me as well, he was saying, you know, people talk about the end of the world and how we're destroying the planet and all these things, and they talk about it like just with no passion. Like, yeah, all these animals are getting extinct and there's a hole in the ozone layer, and there's just this kind of sense of inevitability, like
defeat.
Yeah, like this is what we're doing, and I don't have a clue what I'm going to do about it. So, you know, that's just how it is. And you know, for me, it was really good to hear that. Like, there isn't just like a one answer. It's like, what can I do? One thing that
it's not your job to come up with that answer. You can't be expected. This is a 10,000-year process that's unfolded across the planet over countless generations. It's alluring, it's seductive to think that there's some easy answer to it.
Right.
I mean, how nice would that be, right? Wouldn't it be awesome to know that all you had to do was go on a 100% this diet, or all you had to do was just totally recycle? Or if there was just one, that's seductive. The idea that there's that easy of an answer. The mature thing realizes the complexity and there's a lot going on. But here's the mistake I think of. And so sometimes you bring this to people and they'll be like, well, what do we do? And they'll get mad about it if you can't tell them exactly what they should do. And it's kind of, to me, I think of it, like, here's an analogy. If we're on the Titanic, and the Titanic, you realize the hull has been penetrated. There's a hull. We're taking on water, and the ship is starting to sink. If you going around telling people the ship is starting to sink is your duty, and you are not obligated to know what you're supposed to do about that.
Right.
It's just your job to let everybody know. You're just warning everybody.
Right.
If you can find a life raft, awesome, that much better. But you shouldn't be faulted for letting us know, because people have that attitude of like, well, if we don't have a plan, then I don't want to know the ship is sinking, so I'll just go down with it. It's like, that's a really bizarre way of thinking for me.
Right.
I'm a survivor, and I intend to go as far through this thing as consciously as I can. I think we need to take that approach. And now is the time to start looking at life rafts. And I think really what's going to happen is that every person following their passion finds another tile in the mosaic of the answer to this story. Right. And if you follow your passion like you are, like I am, we start to unfold our unique contribution to the answer. Right. Because it's going to take all of us doing that. Personally, I feel like we're way past carrying capacity on the planet, which means, that we're not going to be able to sustain this population. Incidentally, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a huge die-off either. It doesn't have to work like that. So it just means that if we're already seeing in the developed world a reduction in population right now, so that means the next generation will be smaller and smaller and smaller in those developed nations, and it looks like it's moving towards that globally too. So our population is probably going to peak very soon, and then it's going to start to wane down, and it's just going to have to, because we're going to have to establish a new kind of balance. And in the meantime, we just look at strategies for, I call it rewilding. How do we rewild our lives?
Yeah, totally. I would love to talk to you a bit more about the population thing. After reading this and talking to you, I was like really not into the idea of having a lot of children. Like, we have one child already. I can imagine probably having 2 or maybe 3. But there's no way I want to have, any more than that. And I mentioned this on one of these videos, and people started freaking out and saying, no, overpopulation is a myth, and all of this kind of stuff. And I think people really don't usually have the perspective that's offered through this book and the things that you share of, as we produce more food, we can support more humans being here. So then we produce more food to support the more humans. So then we, produce more humans, and it just, and we basically ended up killing off all kinds of other species. I hear that the extinction rate is something like 150 species a day at the moment are being killed off. And, you know, people maybe think, like, what's the big deal with agriculture? What's the big deal with there being 7 billion humans or whatever? You know, like, everything's okay, isn't it? Like, we can have more humans, but it doesn't feel that way to me from reading this. So maybe could you go into that a bit more about this kind of overpopulation myth and maybe how you see it?
Well, the overpopulation myth, I think, in fairness, I hope that I articulate it well. I feel like I understand that perspective. That perspective says that, well, technically we could fit a lot more people here if we distribute food better, if we grow food more efficiently. There is space. We can stack and pack a lot more people. True. That is true. It's a myopic perspective that looks only at... That perspective kind of sees human beings as the real goal of nature, right? That understanding says the goal of nature is humans. And or believes that regardless of the goal of nature, humans should be able to hijack the planet and we are the dominant force species, right? I want to add to that. This piece, I bring this up in a lot of interviews, and I actually struggle to understand whether or not I'm coming across, people understand what I'm saying here, but there's a cultural paradigm, a meme that I grew up with, that you grew up with, that anybody living in the West has grown up with, essentially says that our next step is that we leave Earth, and we do it in spaceships, and then we go basically colonize other planets or moons, right? We grew up with that idea.
Right.
That is what the transhumanists of the planet, that's the agenda, is to get us off. They see this planet almost like a prison, and that our duty is to leave it. And if we leave it in ashes, so be it. We'll go to the next planet. We'll destroy that one too, and then we'll keep jumping planets or whatever. Okay, so that paradigm, if you believe that, it's hard to understand what's the problem with so many people.
Right.
That paradigm says that's the goal of the whole thing, is to get enough people together and enough resources and enough technology that we can split and get out of here. I don't think it's realistic. Anyway, okay, so that perspective says, yes, we can fit more people. Yes, we can. That is absolutely true. The problem is that in doing that, we're destabilizing the planetary ecosystems so much, and this is what people forget. Because they live in cities and they get their food from stores, because they buy their clothes at stores and they don't see the fields that grow the cotton, they forget that ecosystems are where all the resources come from that allow us to keep populating and living here. See, we can't eat synthetic food. We have to eat living things. Things have to be made out of cells, and those cells have to grow in ecosystems. So if we destroy those ecosystems, we won't be able to resource ourselves. That idea of like, oh, we're going to go to space, well, my question is, where does the food come from? How is this going to work? Right. Realistically, if we continue to grow the human population, at current paradigm, it's at the extinction of other species. Right. There's always species going extinct, but we are currently somewhere between as high as 100% above ambient levels of extinction rate. So we're way past normal extinction levels right now, and this seems to be human caused. That's what's interesting about it. So we could fit more people, but I don't think that we can do it sustainably. I don't think anybody could argue that. I mean, people who do argue that definitely don't understand what we're talking about here. They're not understanding that wild lands are what allows... Wild lands basically have to be raped by agriculture in order for agriculture to work. Once agriculture runs... See, ask yourself this question, if you're struggling with any of this idea about agriculture. What happened to Egypt? What happened there? I mean, this was a massive civilization. It wasn't just a little city around those 3 pyramids, right? We're talking about a massive city. And was it all dune desert at that time? Of course not. It was an incredibly fertile area. What destroyed it? Agriculture. Turned it into a desert. Desertified it. And I think it's important to point out, that was organic agriculture. They did not have inorganic agriculture at the time. There was no Monsanto, there was no synthetic fertilizers. Through organic farming methods, that were better than the organic farming methods that we're using in California right now. When you get that USDA organic stamp, that's lesser than what they were doing in Egypt, and they destroyed Egypt. What happened to Babylon, the Fertile Crescent, where we all come from? It's a desert now, it's Iraq now. It was a fertile land that was destroyed through agriculture. Right. What happened to the Inca? What happened to the Aztec and the Maya, who destroyed their soils through growing corn? It desertifies land. Right. So the problem is we eventually run out. And the only reason that the middle of the United States is still arable, the reason we can still grow plants, is because we're synthetically fertilizing dead sand, essentially. We're taking dust and sand, pouring nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into it. It allows us to grow weak plants. But essentially that area is going to become a desert too. I mean, agriculture turns healthy ecosystems to deserts.
Right. And I think something that I'd like to point out about the extinction of species as well that I didn't really think about until I read it in here was, well, what's the point of having lots of species? Like, what's the point of having variety? And, you know, it's healthier that way. Like, if you only have one species of big cat and one species of prey and one plant that the prey eat, you know, then you have a really weak system that's, like, super prone to collapsing. And so, you know, I think that's nothing that was never explained to me when I was growing up. You know, since I was in school, I heard about animals going extinct and save the pandas and all these things, but nothing was ever explained to me about why. You know, so I thought that was.
Yeah, great point. So we need that diversity. And the other thing to point out is when you go in the opposite direction. For those who've heard me talk before, this is nothing new, but for those who haven't, this may come as new information. When you domesticate an organism, you weaken it. This is important to understand because here's the thing. With wild lettuce will just grow outside in nature. I have wild lettuce grows all over my property. It does not require me to till the soil. It does not require me to keep pests off it. It does not need any pesticide, herbicide. It doesn't need any fertilizer. If I took a wild lettuce seed and I put it in my garden, that plant would grow. And when it went to seed, it would start to escape out of my garden and start to grow around my yard. You could picture the same thing would be true if you took dandelion seeds and put them in your garden. How long can you keep them in your garden? They're going to spread around, they'll be in your neighbor's yard. Now think about a regular lettuce. Does it escape your garden? Never. It doesn't. In fact, it's the opposite. Not only does it not escape, you have to run around all day long serving it in order to keep it alive. It needs life support. Right. It needs really special soil. It needs lots of fertilizers, or again, even if they're organic, it needs to have the pests kept from it, whether you do that through pesticides and herbicides or you do it through some kind of natural method. You still have to protect it from pests. You have to protect it from temperatures. It needs water. The wild lettuce is really strong and robust. It's not like that. Right. We see this with our dogs. When we start purebreeding these dogs, they end up with diseases. Right. So you have dogs who are prone to heart problems, dogs who are prone to eye problems, ear problems, hip problems, deafness, right? These are all traits that get accentuated in... So what's happening to humans? Here's what happens to domesticated humans who've bred this long, like we have, on an agricultural system that continuously delivers us to weaker, more processed foods. Diabetes, heart disease, and cardiovascular diseases, cancers, obesity, blood sugar imbalance issues of all kinds, insanity, lots of mental health issues. And we could go on all day and we get arthritic problems, autoimmune problems, all of these things, digestive problems, all coming out of how weak we've made ourselves through this process. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you can look at it like this. When you start to remove yourself from nature, you get weaker and weaker and sicker because nature is like the energy source. Right. That's the source. And the further you get from the source, the more like withered and sick and troll-like you become. It's like that Lord of the Rings metaphor. You have those elves who live real close to nature, and then you have those like orc creatures that were elves that left nature behind and became these twisted, demonic caricatures of themselves. Right. And we're becoming like that. So we look at indigenous people prior to getting the food that we have today. So if you can't go and look now and go, you can't look at the indigenous person with no teeth and Adidas on who's eating white flour now. That doesn't count. when we look at natural indigenous people who have not taken on our lifestyle yet, always these perfect teeth, no cavities, broad dental arches, broad nasal passages, broad hips, perfect replication, no diseases of civilization, right? You look at us, we are like those orcs. We're like, I mean, hopefully not, but realistically, right, you go out there, you go out to civilization, and you're seeing like fat, twisted, ogre-y, sick skin issues, hair issues, cataracts and drool and it's like because we've become this like weird, twisted demon. We've removed ourselves from the source, and we get sick from that. So we've got to start moving in a positive direction back towards where health, strength, and life force come from. We can't. There's this idea that you can't. If you're trying to get to Canada and you're driving towards Mexico, no amount of slowing down gets you to Canada. That's important because, we are headed in a certain direction. Now, we've done all these cool things like recycling and driving Priuses. Now, that's all slowing down, but it's still not taking us toward the source. It's just taking us towards hell slower.
Oh, Lord.
Right? We're drawing it out, if that makes sense. We're not. That's not a turnaround. And going in the other direction at all. I think we're lost in the woods, and we need to stop. We need to take stock of where we're at, and we need to try to remember our last known location and move towards it a little bit.
So I want to go into that next. Where do we go from here? I just one more question on this theme. Why do you think that it's so appealing to move into civilization? Like, for example, the Bushmen with the Adidas trainers on. Why does it feel so appealing? I watched a documentary recently where they were describing our kind of culture, like civilization, Western way, as kind of like a teenage boy culture. It's like everything is about like cars and smoking and drugs and alcohol and everything like that that's kind of appealing to teenage boys and not really anybody else. And I was like, that really makes sense to me. And why would a Bushman in the Kalahari say, yeah, I want some of that?
I think that these documentaries that you're describing, I've watched a lot of this kind of thing, they are very misleading. They're giving us things through our own perspective. We're not seeing things accurately here. Most of the time, these indigenous people have been pushed off of their native lands. And usually it's because their lands are resource rich.
Right.
And they're pushed into an area that's useless to the colonists. In other words, does not have much resource. And then they struggle there to stay alive, right? They have often had their best and brightest murdered through genocides. So now their breeding population does not have the genetic strength it once had.
Right.
They've been exposed to Western disease. That's what happened to the Native Americans here.
Right.
They have lost access to their native hunting grounds and foraging grounds, so they no longer have access to the foods that kept them strong and healthy. And they're constantly being encroached upon and disempowered by civilization. So the question is, if these people were in their full strength and their full power in their natural world, would they be attracted to this lifestyle? Based on the accounts I see of Native American people from when they first interacted with the colonists, I say no.
Right.
Typically what you hear in these accounts is, we don't want anything to do with this way of life. You have all gone mad. You have a disease of your mind. You can't even see that. You can't even communicate with the natural spirits of the land anymore. You can't communicate with the animals anymore, the plants. You've lost touch. You've gone mad. Because those people weren't in that situation yet. Now, if we look at Native Americans, if you were living on an impoverished reservation, completely overtaken with booze and alcohol, and you had to wear hand-me-down clothes of the Western civilization, and you couldn't afford a car, and of course you're going to be attracted to trying to immerse yourself in that world, but it's deceptive to look at that and think, oh, they want to give up their traditional life way. They don't have their traditional life way.
Right,
so that's not, they're not choosing between their traditional life way and our life way. They're choosing between living at the poverty level of our life way or trying to get higher up on the ladder. Right. And it's the same reason you and I work so hard. right? We're trying to climb that ladder too because we don't want to be at that poverty level where we have to struggle for all of our needs. And so we're willing to sell something of ourselves in order to try to, we're willing to give up some of that time that we would otherwise maybe spend laying naked in the sun in order to try to keep above poverty level because this culture kind of forces us to. And it's done that to them too. So it's there's more going on, and it can be awfully simplified in a half an hour of National Geographic. It can seem so simple, and it's often really complicated.
Got it. Okay, so let's start talking a bit of solutions. I know something that you're already into is foraging and other kind of wildlife skills, I guess. I don't know what you would categorize them as, but knowing how to kind of navigate your way around a forest, for example, things like that. These are the kind of things that personally I would really love for Araya to be learning as she's growing up, and the things that I feel like are essential for moving forward. But it feels like it's something that people don't really learn. So what would you kind of recommend for people to start taking steps in that direction? Like, what would they forage? How would they learn?
Okay, big topic. I need to back us up out of that for a second and break it down into a few components. But I want to say this first. We've been talking a lot about agriculture and wild foods, and the difference between the two. But I want to be clear here. Agriculture is absolutely a critical part of our strategy forward. It has to be, because there's not enough of this wild food for us all to... We are going to have to use agriculture. Immediately what we need to be doing is moving away from large-scale, monocropped, toxic agriculture towards smaller-scale, local agriculture based off species that are more native to the area where we're growing. And that's the direction we want to be moving towards as we rebuild our ecosystems, because that's the goal, is we have to actually build the ecosystems back up. So we've got to stop clearing thousands of miles of land and growing corn. We need to move towards all of us having our own gardens where we produce a lot of food and we work with local producers. My solution approach to this whole issue we've talked about, I call rewilding. People use that term for a lot of different things. Here's what I mean when I say rewilding. When I look at nature, I see, and this has been corroborated by native people from all over the world, I see that our reality kind of breaks down into these categories. It breaks down into things that are earth, things that are water, things that are air, and things that are fire. That's a really old, anarchistic, kind of seemingly antiquated paradigm that the world is made up of 4 elements.
Right.
I don't think it's that antiquated. They still use it in science. They call it solids, liquids, gases, and plasma, 4 states of matter. So it sounds like more technical or whatever. It sounds like more futuristic. But it's still that same view. Solids are earth, liquids are water, gases are air, plasma is fire. So it's still around. Okay, the nature's made up of those 4 elements. And we actually have to eat all 4 elements every day. So when we talk about nutrition, we get into this mistake of thinking of just food. To me, nutrition is all 4 elements. We eat food, that's the earth, the stuff that comes from the soil. We drink water, and we need it just as much or more than we need food, so it's definitely part of our nutrition. We breathe, respirate air, so it's an important part of our nutrition. And we require sunlight in its full spectrum for the production of vitamin D and critical hormones. So we actually live by eating earth, water, air, and sunlight in the form of fire, right? So we need all of them. We also put all of them back out every day. So we poop out earth, we pee out water, we breathe out air, and we sweat out that fire energy. So actually, every day we're pulling it all in, and we're putting it all out. Now, if you look at the environments human beings have chosen to move towards, these habitats that we live in now, they typically don't have any natural earth. In other words, there's not really any soil there, there's not really any stone there, and there's certainly not all these natural things that come up out of those, like the plants and animals that come from soil. So they have divorced themselves from that, right? And then next would be, how's the water situation? What do they have? Well, they have infrastructure of piping bringing toxically laden dead water in, so they don't have access to natural water. The air in their homes has been conditioned, either heated or cooled or both, so it's essentially like a cooked or refrigerated air. It's devoid of the electrical properties, the ionization that's required for our health, so they have dead air. and then they all only have artificial light. There's no sunlight, so they've cut themselves off from all the four elements. Where do people go to try to heal? They go to the hospital. And what's the hospital got? No earth, no water, no air, no fire, none of the natural things. It's a synthetic everything there. I often joke with people that the reason you have such toxic organisms in hospitals, for instance, you all know that the thing about staph, MRSA, in hospitals, right? You're very likely to get a staph infection if you get opened up in a hospital. I would often joke that the staph is there to try to kill as many people as possible so that they can compost and turn into soil so that nature can start to recreate an ecosystem in there. Because it's so sterile that nature abhors the vacuum. Okay, so what we need to do then is we need a systematic, strategic approach to bringing the four elements back into our lives. So let's start with the first one, which is you brought up food. Let's say that somebody's all the way on the extreme end. They live on a diet of Monsanto genetically modified corn syrup and corn solids with soybean oil and cottonseed. And some canola. If that's their life, the direction is to start moving towards a more whole food diet, moving towards organic foods that they can still buy at their supermarkets, right? But they're moving towards healthier food that has more nutrition and away from all that GMO stuff that's really toxic to us. Right. The next step, of course, is they move to a committed, totally organic diet. That's where you're starting to get into the much better stuff. From there, it's really good to start looking at your farmers markets, local agriculture, getting connected to local agriculture, whether it's through community-supported agriculture like a CSA membership, or it's just visiting your local farmers market, or it's visiting your local farms. The next stage past that is we get on that small-scale agriculture at home, starting to grow some of our own food, like I'm sure you guys are doing, and we're doing here. And then there's a stage past that, but it's pretty advanced, and that's when we start actually harvesting stuff out of nature. Now, I do that to a very small extent, but I try to bring that into my life. And I know people who bring it into their life a lot more. And it's pretty important that we find people who can teach us, because we don't know how to see it properly. Yeah. When we walk into nature, we're not aware of what we're looking at. And it's not this, in knowing a plant is edible is not the same as knowing how to use that plant. I want to point that out. It's not going, oh, I know, yeah, that's wild lettuce, I know about that. Well, cool, you know about it. How do you harvest it? Right. When do you harvest it? How do you process it? How do you make it edible? Because things in nature are not like, it's not this raw food diet out in the wild. Things are too toxic. It requires processing. So what I want to say is you have Monsanto's corn syrup on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum you have this hunting and gathering. And that's, nobody's really living on this extreme, and nobody's really living at this extreme either, except those naked people, they call them down where you are, right, the uncontacted tribes. Right. Outside of that, everybody's somewhere in here. And this is why I think it's interesting, all these diet wars going on, and all this like slander back and forth of all the different dietary extremes, and everyone blaming each other and saying terrible things about each other and fighting over whose diet's superior. It's like, guys, none of you are over here. None of you. Right. None of us. We're all somewhere in here. We're all in the same boat. We're all in the sinking Titanic. Relax. Take a breath for a second. Let's work together, right? We're all trying to get somewhere over here, and we're all over here somewhere. So there's that direction we need to move in. But I think it's pretty simple. It's like, it's getting towards food that you know where it was grown, or who grew it, or where you harvested, or who harvested it. It's moving in that direction. With water, it's a similar thing. You have at one end, you have things like, water that's delivered through 16 miles of rotting pipes laden with chlorine, fluoride, the neurotoxin, lye, sodium hydroxide, and phosphoric acid delivered in your tap, potentially actually contaminated with hundreds of pharmaceuticals and or contraceptives from the urine and feces of people that's been processed and filtered to be made into the tap water. So that's this end of the water spectrum. At this end, there's water that flows up naturally from springs, right up out of aquifers, totally free from nature, that's been underwater since before the beginning of industry. And it's totally pure and clean. And you can make, 68% of your body out of. And everybody's somewhere in there. I created findaspring.com to help people connect for free with those water sources. And that website's about to be completely relaunched, really sexy new, so that's exciting. Nice. So look for that. But the idea is we've got to be moving in this direction. Over here we have, we have that really toxic tap water. We have all of those bottled waters that are usually just tap water and or well water that's now contaminated by the plastics of the bottle they're in. We have all the filtered waters, which more and more we're realizing are don't produce a biocompatible water. Because nature does not, there isn't filtered water like we think of in nature. The water in nature is very different from distilled water, and it's very different from reverse osmosis water. Those two types of water are so sterilized and stripped down, nature would not recognize those as water. They're essentially molecularly pure H2O. And that's very similar. If I came to you and told you that white sugar was better for you than chewing on a sugarcane plant, you'd tell me that was ridiculous.
Right.
If I came to you and said, hey, cocaine is better for you than coca leaves, you'd know that was crazy. Right? If I came to you and said, hey, this white flour is better for you than the whole ground wheat, you'd say, no way, impossible. If I come to you and say, hey, this distilled water is better for you than spring water, you'd be like, well, maybe it is. Maybe not, just saying that. In general, people think that way. Right. They don't realize that nature does not produce molecularly pure H2O. That's man-made through lab processes. We do it with machines, and it creates a water that's not biocompatible to us. So water in nature actually has algae in it that's stripped out by these kind of systems, has minerals in it, those are stripped out by these kind of systems, and potentially has a crystalline structure that's been damaged or destroyed through these processes. So that water is chemical grade, pharmaceutical grade water. So we can consider a movement back towards healthier waters, and really where people want to be looking is for spring water that they can access themselves, and or well water, which can also be really good if you have a good well. You're getting water from deep underground that's still really clean. The next piece is looking for fresh air. This is an easy one. We can open our windows more. We can get outside more. Even if you live where you think the air is really toxic outside, you need to know that the air inside is more toxic. Right. So if you're like, oh, but I'm in downtown Chicago, the air is really bad. Well, the air inside is 90% worse. Mm-hmm. Got to get those windows open and let electrically fresh air in. And in the meantime, you may want to consider living indoors is not natural for people. So consider something to remove the dust out of your air, like a HEPA filter. And that's because dust is dead skin, and dead skin breeds mites, and we end up breathing that. And if you're not filtering that out of your air, your lungs become the filter for that air. So when you see dust accumulating in your house, you're breathing it, and it's yours and other people's dead skin, and it's infected with mites. If you're living outside, this would be an issue. So we need to keep our houses clean by filtering our air, by bringing plants into our house, ideally, especially if you're living in a place or part of the world where most of the building materials contain those volatile organic compounds. You're bringing a new piece of carpeting, a new piece of furniture, some kind of new laminate, countertop, blah, 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 a new printer, a new computer. These things are outgassing things like formaldehyde and other volatile organic compounds. Now, plants will eat that out of the air. They'll literally breathe that in and take it apart and disassemble it so it's not toxic. So getting houseplants is really important. Keeping the moisture level right in your air, maybe through a humidifier, or maybe just having some boiling water in your wood stove, whatever it is for you, so that you've got air that's not causing your sinuses to crack and dry out. Right? We can change the air in our house a little bit. Ionizers are really helpful, but the key really is getting outside as much as we can, breathing as much natural air as we can. And the last piece I want to talk about is that fire piece, is reconnecting ourselves with sunlight. Getting sunlight on our skin, on naked skin, without sunblock, with as little clothing as we can, particularly around midday, around noon. That's when the maximum UV is present. And even if you're somebody with fairly light skin, you still need this. You need a lot less of it than somebody with really dark skin. So we all have different adaptations. The darker your skin is, the more sunlight you need. The lighter your skin is, the less. But of course, with that UV light, we get vitamin D production. That's a master hormone for our body. Without vitamin D, we have a lot of different types of cancer. So vitamin D is critical. The sun causing skin cancer, come on, right? What an absurdity. Maybe for really sick chihuahuas, but it's not the sun. There was all these triggering factors, right? We blame it on the sun. It's like, hey, guess what? All the organisms on the planet have always relied on the sun. We used to live out under it. I think it's not the sun. So we need that sunlight. That's really crucial. So if we look at earth, air, fire, water, it starts to get really easy to put a pattern together to rewild ourselves. We just start exposing ourselves to the right food, the right water, the right air, and sunlight. That puts us back in right relationship with the earth again. Right? That's how we start connecting with the planet again. And appreciating that the source of our health is ecosystems in nature, not stores, not the internet. Right? It's actually out there. That's where it's happening. And it's getting harder and harder for us because we're more and more being driven into a cyber reality. So we have to really get clear here. There's a strong transhumanist agenda to get us focused right in on our machines. Well, one last piece I want to add, and that's getting your bare feet onto the earth. That's crucial because your bare feet on the earth allow you to become to conduct free electrons from the earth into your body. Now, if you think about it, all the wild organisms of the planet do this, except us. So we're the only species that willingly takes an insulative layer, wraps it. To give you the metaphor there, it's so obvious, right? It's like, oh, disconnected from the earth much? Time to get grounded. So getting ourselves. So how do you put all this together? It's really easy. Go outside. Right? That's how you do it. Go outside. And as you start to work with people in your area to learn different plants and you find out what different springs are, it's great. You can go outside barefoot, pick a little of this and a little of that to eat, drink a little of the water, breathe fresh air, get sunlight on your body, come home totally refreshed. That's how you build health. And when individuals start doing that, here's the big piece I learned from my friend Arthur. He really instilled this in me. It's really unrealistic to expect people to try to protect ecosystems that they don't have relationships to.
Right.
That's ultimately it. You get a foraging ground, you get a swimming spot, you find a spring that you like to get your water from, you have a vested interest in protecting that area. It's a little different than some abstract Save the Pandas email campaign that goes on, right? It's like, well, whatever, yeah, I guess I'll make pandas. It's not the same. You don't have that connection to it. So getting outside is how we engender that connection that makes us want to protect the earth for those future generations.
Beautiful, thank you. That was really inspiring. Totally made sense. And the one other thing that I wanted to mention that made sense to me to do in these last couple of weeks since reading the book was to go to the website of civilinternational.org, who I'm sure you probably know about. They're a charity who look out for the rights of the uncontacted tribes. You know, the uncontacted tribe video, that's from them. And they protect the kind of indigenous tribal peoples of the world. And it's a charity who I've been really into for many years. And after reading this book, it was just like the only thing I could think of to do was like, I have to make a donation to Survival and write to Daniel.
Awesome. So I'll take a look at that. I'm aware of it, but I've never really given it my time properly. So I'll take a peek at that. It brings up for me some interesting... I had this interesting thought the last time I was in the rainforest, and I was thinking about these uncontacted tribes, and the question emerged for me, if we're going to protect, let's say we're going to protect jaguar because they're at risk of extinction, and they're a wild animal, we put all these programs in place to protect them. So then the question emerges, are these uncontacted tribes, do they deserve that kind of endangered species status?
Right.
And it's very interesting, right? It gets very confusing when you have these rules, like, for instance, in parts of the rainforest where it's illegal to hunt because they're protecting those animals there. But we don't make it illegal for jaguar to hunt.
Right.
But we do sometimes make it illegal for the indigenous to hunt.
Yeah.
So how do because we don't have a holistic view of this, and the challenge is a lot of the times the people who are even doing the work to try to protect these people don't have that big picture view of what these people really are. What they actually represent is our only link, they're the umbilical cord back to our source. So how do we protect them? Do we protect them? What's that look like? So totally. It's a really interesting thing that we're facing right now in our generation. We're facing it. We're putting less energy towards that than we are towards tigers. And I really care about tigers, but it's funny, given how anthropocentric we are, that we are missing that it's happening to us too. And that's fascinating. So, hopefully this inspires people to get involved somehow at the personal level, at the group level, at the sort of global level, because it's really time. We're delicately poised on the precipice of forever right now, and civilization wants you to think that you'll just be able to. Don't worry about it. You can just download yourself into some kind of mainframe, and we'll all go to Mars together. I like it here. I'm staying electrically connected. I think it's a good idea for you too.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Daniel. This was super inspiring. I felt like we actually really got somewhere of like things that people can do. And I really hope that people appreciate this as much as I do. I thank you so much for thinking about these things and for sharing with everyone.
Yeah, thank you I don't usually get to, my interviews usually end up painfully surface level, so it's really fun to explore some of this. So thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I'd love to, I'd love to hear what people's feedback is. So if everybody would take the time to put their comments here and let us know how you're feeling about all of this stuff, because I think, I see on the internet, and I see how people comment and how you get one or two comments, they start off really good, and then it turns into all these debates and arguments amongst people, and it's like, guys, we need to start doing something here besides, this. I want to hear what you're doing. I want to hear what you're actively doing, and not why it's better than what somebody else is doing. What are you doing? What are you doing? What's your plan? We need a strategy. So I'm just interested in how people are responding to this. I don't think I brought up anything that's shockingly new right now. I think this is all kind of old information, and a lot of us intuitively get it, even if we've never heard it before. So I'm curious how it resonates, too, with people, and, what you plan to do.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Daniel's websites, again, are danielvitalis.com, sirthrival.com, and findaspring.org, which is about to be updated, apparently. So check those out. Thank you so much again, Daniel. This was absolutely beautiful. More than I could have hoped for.
Oh, good. Thanks a lot.
All right. Ciao.